I always thought I'd have time to say goodbye to the house that built me. Instead, I came home to a stranger's. Lock on the door and my life, packed into cardboard boxes on the porch. There was no warning, no family meeting, not even a text. Just a cold, official notice taped to the front gate. Property sold. Vacate immediately. My hands shook as I tried the key, refusing to believe what I already knew. It didn't fit. I stood there numb, as neighbors watched from behind curtains. Their faces a mix of pity and curiosity. My childhood bedroom, the kitchen where I learned to bake, the backyard where I buried my first pet. Gone. Just like that. I called my mother, my voice cracking, but she didn't answer. My brother sent a single text. It's done. Don't make this harder. The betrayal hit harder than any slap. I wasn't just losing a house. I was being erased from my own history. As I stared at the empty windows, heartbreak twisted into something sharper. If they wanted me gone, they'd regret it. I made a silent vow right there on the front steps. I would get it all back. And when I did, they'd never set foot inside again growing up in that house. I learned early that love was conditional and attention was a currency I could never quite afford. My brother was the golden child. His trophies lined the mantle, his laughter filled the halls, and every family story seemed to orbit around his latest achievement. I was the afterthought, the one who set the table, cleaned up the messes, and faded into the background of every holiday photo. If something went wrong, it was my fault. If something went right, it was because someone else deserved the credit. I remember birthdays where my cake was an afterthought, squeezed in between my brother's soccer games and my parents' dinner plans. When I brought home good grades, they barely looked up from their phones. But when my brother passed a class, it was cause for celebration. I was always the one expected to give up my room for guests, to share my things, to keep the peace when tempers flared. Sacrifice became second nature, and I convinced myself that being needed was the same as being loved. But the truth was I was never truly seen. My opinions were dismissed, my dreams ignored, and my pain minimized. I became the family scapegoat, blamed for problems I didn't create and expected to fix what I didn't break. The house was my shelter, but it was also a daily reminder that I was less than. Losing it felt like losing the last piece of proof that I ever belonged at all. The shock of finding my belongings on the porch was only the beginning of a cold, calculated reality. I spent the next 48 hours unraveling the web they had spun. Through public records and a frantic conversation with the local clerk, I discovered the sale wasn't a sudden decision. For months, it was a coup. They had held secret meetings with real estate developers, crafting a narrative that the house was too expensive to maintain and that selling was what's best for everyone. They didn't just exclude me. They actively bypassed my legal rights. My signature on the closing documents? Forged. My mother had taken my old ID, claimed I was traveling, and signed away my inheritance without batting an eye. Every time they asked me to help with random paperwork over the summer, they were securing the foundation of their lie. They treated me like a child who wouldn't know how to look, wouldn't know how to ask, and certainly wouldn't have the guts to stand up. They had stripped my history, packed my memories into boxes, and handed the keys to strangers, all while smiling across the dinner table. My own family had traded my home for a bank transfer, leaving me with nothing but the silence of an empty porch. The walls of the motel room were thin, papered in a sickly shade of yellow that seemed to mock my newfound status. I spent 3 nights staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled arguments of strangers in the next room while my own family was likely celebrating their profit elsewhere. I had lost the only place I ever called home, the only sanctuary that knew my secrets. Every box I had hauled from the porch held a fragment of a girl who no longer existed, an identity I was slowly watching dissolve. I felt erased from my own history, a ghost lingering in the margins of a life that wasn't mine anymore. The pain was sharp, an incessant ache that kept me awake until the sunrise painted the cheap carpet gray. But by the 4th morning, the tears finally ran dry, and the grief solidified into something much colder. I stopped mourning the loss and started studying the map of my ruin. They wanted me destitute, scattered, and broken. They expected me to fade away without a fight. Instead, I rose from that bed with a singular, quiet purpose. If they burned my history, I would build a fortress from the ashes. I refused to let my family's greed dictate my final chapter. The motel room became my makeshift headquarters, cluttered with legal texts and property records. I downloaded on a stuttering Wi-Fi connection. I dove into the intricacies of real estate law, searching for any technicality that could undo the sale. I discovered the developer who bought the house was a known shark, but one currently drowning in a sea of his own unpaid property taxes. He didn't want a home. He wanted a quick flip. I took 2 extra shifts at a local warehouse, my body aching, my mind constantly calculating every cent I scraped together. I opened a separate, shielded bank account under a different name and channeled every penny of my savings into it. I started tracking the house daily, watching for any sign that it was being flipped. My life shrank to the essentials: work, study, and the hunt. I became a ghost to my own family, answering no calls, letting them believe I had finally vanished into the city's underbelly. They thought they had left me with nothing. But they didn't know I had become an expert at finding everything hidden in plain sight. I wasn't just saving money. I was building a barricade. The house was no longer just a piece of property. It was the weapon I would use to force my family into a corner. They had sold my history for profit, but I was about to buy it back with interest, and they wouldn't have a single clue it was me. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of poetic justice. Through a private real estate database, I learned the developer's assets were being frozen due to a catastrophic business failure. My childhood home was suddenly back on the market, priced low for a desperate, immediate liquidation. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at the listing. It was meant to be. I immediately contacted an old family acquaintance, a retired probate attorney who owed my late grandmother a debt of gratitude. He agreed to act as my legal representative, setting up an anonymous trust as the purchasing entity. We used a silent partner, a real estate investor who cared only about the profit margin, to front the initial bid while I poured every cent of my savings into the escrow account. The process was agonizingly slow, filled with back-and-forth negotiations, but the developer, desperate for a lifeline, finally accepted. I watched from the shadows as the deed transitioned into the name of the trust I controlled. My family had no idea that the house they sold for profit had returned to the one person they were certain they had erased. I wasn't just a former resident anymore. I was the legal landlord of my own history, ready to reclaim the keys. The morning they arrived to show the future buyers around their old trophy, the sunlight was blindingly clear. They drove up the circular driveway with the familiar, arrogant swagger of owners, my brother already gesturing toward the windows as if he still held the keys. I stood on the porch, my hand resting calmly on the cold metal of the new brass handle, watching them approach. Their smiles withered the instant they saw me. My mother's jaw dropped, her face flushing a mottled, blotchy red, while my father stopped mid-stride, his eyes darting toward the front door as if expecting it to be locked by a stranger. "What are you doing here?" My brother snapped, his voice tight with sudden, frantic uncertainty. "This is private property. We have the keys from the realtor." I didn't reach for my phone or my temper. I simply pulled a fresh, crisp copy of the property deed from my pocket and held it out. "You're mistaken," I said, my voice cutting through the humid air with surgical precision. "The realtor is an employee of my trust, and you are currently trespassing on my private residence." The silence that descended was absolute, thick enough to choke on. They scrambled to look at the document, their hands trembling as they recognized the legal seal of ownership in my name. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They hadn't just sold a house. They had sold their access to me, and now they were the ones standing on the outside looking in. "I bought it back," I continued, meeting their wide, horrified gazes without blinking. "And as the owner, I am officially banning you from this property. You are never welcome here again." My father looked like he might collapse, his face turning an ashen gray, while my brother's eyes burned with an impotent, blistering rage he couldn't hide. Their power had evaporated. I was the home, and I was the gatekeeper. The news of their public eviction spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, leaving my family's reputation in absolute ruins. Neighbors who had always sensed their arrogance felt no sympathy, and distant relatives who had been kept in the dark by my parents were horrified by the depth of their betrayal. My brother tried to spin a story of a legal misunderstanding, but the deed didn't lie. Their social circle, built on prestige and the display of wealth, suddenly became a hollow echo chamber, turning against them once the truth of the sale and their attempt to erase me came to light. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I was too busy reclaiming my sanctuary. I spent months stripping away the cold, clinical aesthetic my stepmother had imposed, replacing it with warmth, art, and the ghosts of my own memories. I painted over the walls where I had been ignored and turned the guest wing into a studio where I could finally breathe. The house, once a prison of expectation, was now a home built on my own terms. For the first time in my life, there was no weight in the air. I had finally found my peace, Reclaiming my childhood home wasn't just about the property. It was about reclaiming the version of myself they tried to delete. They thought they could sell my history and leave me with nothing. But they only succeeded in forcing me to build something stronger. Your worth isn't tied to the approval of people who view you as an obstacle. History belongs to those who stand up for it, not those who sell it for a quick profit. If you've ever been betrayed by family, share your story in the comments. Subscribe to Void Revenge Tales for more true tales of justice and redemption.